Då ska vi se, då tänker jag att vi ska dra igång lite grann och vi kommer nu ha en lite kortare föreläsning på grund av covid. Så kommer den bli via länk och sen kommer vi köra ett kort panelsamtal efter. Och sen är det en panel kvar och sen är vi klara för idag. Vilket ju känns som att tiden har gått otroligt fort, eller hur? Men då skulle jag vilja presentera Staca Shehan som är Vice President of the Analytical Services Division på National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Staca, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for allowing me to do this presentation remotely. It's not what I had planned. I had been looking forward to this trip and meeting all of you in person. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to continue to participate, even if remotely. What I'm going to do now is share some slides, hoping that you can see those. And I'm just going to get started. So I am here on behalf of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States. We were created and founded in 1984 by John and Reve Walsh, who are victim parents. They created our organization after the abduction and murder of their son, Adam. He was 6 years old, and the Walshes turned their sadness and frustration into action. And for the past almost 40 years, we have been the nation's resource for families and survivors, law enforcement, child welfare, and other professionals related to issues of missing and exploited children. And we also operate a global clearinghouse for reports on child sexual exploitation. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later in the presentation. So very simply stated, our mission at the National Center is to help find missing children, to reduce child sexual exploitation, and to prevent future victimization. And I'm sure all of you there in the room can see that each one of those mission areas and goals intersects with the issue of child sex trafficking. So today I'm going to share with you the trends that we're seeing related to child sex trafficking in the United States. I'm going to focus in on a type of trafficking we refer to as buyer-perpetrated. I'm going to share some examples of how the internet and technology has changed recruitment, control, and sale of children to buyers. And then finally, I'm also going to share with you some of the numbers and the trends that we're seeing globally related to child sexual exploitation. So with that, I just want to set the scene and give you a description of the 4 different types of trafficking that we see most commonly in the United States. The top 2, pimp-controlled and gang-controlled trafficking, are the ones that have a third party who is controlling the child, who is not related to the child, and who is profiting from the child's exploitation. They're receiving all, or at least the majority, of the money that is spent by the buyers to victimize that child. The bottom 2 are familial and buyer-perpetrated. Even though it seems that we talk about those 2 the least, we're seeing in some research and anecdotally in the cases that we are working that these 2 may be the most prominent. They may be occurring more than the pimp-controlled and gang-controlled, where third parties are involved. So in familial trafficking, the child is sold by a family member or a perceived family member. That means someone who the child calls an auntie or an uncle, but they're not really blood relatives of the child. Buyer-perpetrated is probably the least discussed, and this is when there's no third party at all. It's when the buyer of the child is the one who is exploiting them, taking advantage of those vulnerabilities and exploiting them for sexual exploitation. Now, in the United States in 2000 was the foundation and the cornerstone to our efforts to combat human trafficking. That was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Since 2000, it's been authorized many different times and updated several times as well. This federal law defines child sexual child sex trafficking as any child under the age of 17 and younger who is victimized through commercial sex. And commercial sex is anything that occurs when something of value, it doesn't have to be money, is exchanged for that sex act. Now, for adults, there's an additional need to prove force, fraud, or coercion, and that's not necessary if the child is under the age of 18, 17, and younger. It does clarify through including the words obtaining, patronizing, and soliciting that there's no requirement for a third party. So there's no requirement for what most people would refer to as a pimp or a trafficker, that purely by obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting, that individual is engaging in a commercial sex act with a child, and therefore the child is a trafficking victim, and that adult is the perpetrator, the trafficker. Now, further in 2015, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act clarified, specifically related to buyer-perpetrated trafficking, that individuals who purchase sex from a human trafficking victim can be arrested, prosecuted, and convicted as the sex trafficking offender. That means they're equivalent, they're the same as the pimp or the trafficker. Now, what we see in the United States is, although that's federal law, it has not trickled down into state law in some states. Now, there's a national nonprofit here in the United States called Shared Hope, and they do an annual report and assessment of the state laws related to trafficking. And in 2022, just last year, they found that 10 states do not have a buyer applicable trafficking law, and that 19 states still require proof of a third party controller. So these are things that are most definitely impacting the ability to hold everyone accountable for that child's exploitation, and specifically the buyers. And why is that important? Is because when we are focused in on traffickers being a third party and not the buyer of that child for sex, we are having an over-reliance on proof that that child was under the control of a trafficker or third party. That puts the onus on the child to disclose, that increases a barrier to acknowledgement that victimization is taking place. It also increases the likelihood of a need for a child to testify in the court case, which further victimizes them in a lot of cases. And probably even more importantly, is it's reducing the ability of that child to receive services and receive resources as a child sex trafficking victim. And we're seeing that this is definitely increasing the vulnerability for many of the underserved populations, such as boys, homeless and runaway youth, and those that identify as LGBTQ. These kids are more likely to be interacting directly with the buyers in a form of sex trafficking that's referred to as transactional, or sometimes referred to as survival sex, and that it's increasing their vulnerability when there isn't accountability for the people that are exploiting them, those buyers. And what we're seeing and what we're hearing directly from survivors is when those buyers are held accountable, that it is increasing the positive survivor outcomes and the experiences of justice. They feel that their voice has been heard, the exploitation they have faced is validated, and that there is consequences for those that victimized them. So now I'm going to share a little bit about the statistics that we see at the National Center. So we operate a 24/7 toll-free hotline for the past 39 years, and we've received over 5 million calls related to both missing and exploited children through this hotline number. Now, last year, what we saw was over 27,000 missing children were reported to us. And if you ask the media or families what type of missing child they talk about the most or they fear the most, it's typically those non-family abductions, or what's also referred to as stranger abductions. However, if you can see on this chart, they make up 0.4%, the smallest number of missing child cases. Now, that's great, because in a non-family abduction, there is extreme risk for the child and their safety. But what we want to make sure people understand is that Families and communities and social workers, law enforcement, child welfare as a whole are much more likely to experience a missing child case in which the child has run away than they are any of the other case types. Last year, it made up over 90% of the reports that we received of missing children, and that's consistent going back to our inception in 1984. Now, what we know is that missing children who run away, trends show us that they're likely running away if it's frequently and for a longer period of time. They're running from some sort of abuse or unsafe situation, or they're running to an unsafe situation. And what we know is that not all missing children are exploited through trafficking, and not all child sex trafficking victims are missing children. But we do see a direct connection between those missing children that run away and child sexual exploitation through trafficking. For the past several years, the trend has remained consistent that 1 in 6 of the missing children who run away and were reported to our center were also being victimized through child sex trafficking. And this is consistent across the country. It isn't just a problem of big cities and urban centers. What you can see through this map, the colors of the states designate the number of missing children who are currently recovered, who have been victimized through trafficking. And then the dots, you can see gray and red dots. Those were the number of missing children that were currently listed as missing, so actively missing at the time this map was created at the end of 22. In the red dots are children who were currently missing and believed to be trafficking victims who'd been missing for 3 months or less. And then the gray dots are those that have been missing for 3 months or longer. But as you can see, it's impacting urban, suburban, rural, and tribal communities across the United States. Boys is a topic that I think is not discussed as much when we're talking about child sexual exploitation broadly, but also child sex trafficking specifically. And I think that what you see here on the screen, our numbers are that last year, of the children assigned male at birth, 7% were child sex trafficking victims that we saw. I think that number is remarkably low. I think that we are seeing less of a disclosure rate in boys. We're seeing less of a rate of identification, still some lack of understanding that boys can be victimized as well. So while we are seeing 7%, and that's up from less than 1% about 5 to 7 years ago, I think it's still extremely low and doesn't accurately reflect the exploitation of boys. We're also seeing that children within the child welfare system, so those that are in the care of social services in the state, they are being targeted for victimization at a higher rate. 18% of the children that were reported missing to us who had run away from care were also victims of child sex trafficking last year. Now, what are they targeting? So you've heard me mention several times that buyers are targeting different vulnerabilities and risk factors. So what we've done here is based on the cases that we're working and with the survivors that we have hired as consultants for the National Center to not only review our programs of work, but also to review our materials as well and provide input. We've been able to take those risk factors that buyers are targeting and classify them into 3 different subsets. So those that society has placed upon a child. So that could be, racism, a lack of resources within a community, gang activity, sexism, as well as a general acceptance in the community for the demand for commercial sex. Those things are all society based and they are increasing risks for child sex trafficking victimization. Then, when it comes to the child's family, there's some risk factors that can increase the likelihood and the vulnerability as well that buyers will target. This can include intergenerational sex abuse, where buyers we have seen where they literally state that we know that, or I know that you have been abused in the past, and at least you're going to get paid for it this time. So, also housing instability and homelessness, immigration status are all things not that are the family's fault, but that are specific to the family that can increase those risk factors and increase the targeting by buyers. And then specifically things that are unique to the individual. that if they have a history of trauma, if they lack supportive adult figures in their life, if they have a developmental disability, or if they use or abuse drugs and alcohol. These are all things that buyers will target because the child is vulnerable in each of those areas. Now, one thing that I do want to highlight, and I want to be really careful about the language here, is those children that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, or questioning, they are at a higher risk for trafficking, not because of the fact that they are LGBTQ. They are at a higher risk for victimization because of rejection by society, rejection by their families. And I think this is a topic that we see covered a lot, but sometimes the language appears to implicate that it's because of being LGBTQ. And I just want to clarify that it's not because of that, it's because of how they're treated. Often, they will run away from a home environment that doesn't feel safe because either parents or siblings or people in their community are non accepting of them. And sometimes they're even kicked out. And those kids are rarely reported missing because those people that kick them out of their family or home environment are the ones that would have reported them. So nobody's looking for them except for the buyers. So these are the situations where there's a definite increased vulnerability. Now, I mentioned that we are a global center for child sexual exploitation, and that's through our operation of the cyber tip line. This is a reporting mechanism for the public and for electronic service providers like Google and Facebook, Instagram, Microsoft, Snapchat, anything you can think of that operates online is required in the United States to make reports of possible child sexual abuse material. And as a result of that, we have become the global hub for child sexual exploitation online. The volume is pretty staggering. You can see here that in 2020, we received over 21 million reports. That increased in 2021 to 29 million reports. And then just last year, we received over 32 million reports. Because of that law requiring the reporting of child sexual abuse material, or what is sometimes referred to as child pornography, those report numbers are obviously the highest. Consistently each year, the top three are child sexual abuse material, online enticement of children for sexual acts, and child sex trafficking. Now, when we receive these reports, we review the content and often use an IP address or some other piece of information to determine where this crime is taking place. And that is how we have created this map to show you of those 32 million reports we received last year, where they were sent in the world. Now, I have a feeling you likely are, zeroing in on Sweden specifically, and I'm going to pull up a slide that talks about that. But what you can see here is the United States is red, not the darkest red, just one color below that, indicating that last year we received between 1 and 3 million reports resolved to child sexual exploitation that was occurring right there in the United States. Conversely, in Sweden, you appear as a light yellow, and that indicates that you received between 20 and 50,000 reports of child sexual exploitation last year. This really demonstrates that child sexual exploitation is not the problem of just one country. It is a global problem that requires global participation and cooperation in order to address it. Now, looking at Sweden specifically, you can see that of the reports that we received, the geographic indicators resolved to Sweden in 2019 around 16,800 reports. And just last year, that number grew to 43,000 reports. There's a star there next to that number because historically, these reports were made available to Europol for dissemination to law enforcement in Sweden. But about halfway through the year last year, the Swedish police authority created a direct connection to receive these reports from the National Center directly. They did not receive all 43,000 because they were set up about halfway through the year. About 27,000 were referred to the Swedish police authority. So again, just giving you a highlight, trying to make it clear that this is a global problem, not just a problem of any one country. But we can look at the trends that we're seeing in these reports. And you can see here that it's probably not surprising given their popularity, but of the reports that resolved to Sweden, the two most common reporting ESPs were Facebook and Instagram. Now, I want to talk to you a little more about recruiting. So, I'm going to show you three examples from these reports that we receive. One by a buyer, one by a pimp controlled situation, and then one that's gang controlled. This is actual text that took place in between the trafficker and the child. So I do have to warn you that some of the text is offensive and does contain some curse words. There is no imagery of child sexual abuse material included in the upcoming slides. So this is an example that actually hit the news in the United States, where a buyer was realizing that if he wanted to engage with vulnerable children to purchase them for sex, he could send out messages through Facebook. And he was sending about 400 a day. And it literally only said, "You're pretty, you could make some money." And if he got responses from just 3 to 4 children, then that was a victory for him because he could engage with those specific children. And even though he sent so many, it's more than he would be able to find by just driving around or trying to encounter them in the real world. Excuse me. Here's an example from direct messages. These are all from a trafficker. So he is reaching out, trying to recruit this child, and he is, trying to sell her on a better life. These are the follow-up messages that he sent her, where he's being very specific that he's asking her to escort. He's making it seem like she could make so much money, 7,000 in 1 week. And then he's also implying that, it would benefit her if she recruited other victims and provided them to this trafficker. And then this is a gang controlled situation where the bubbles that are going to come up on the left hand side in black, um, in black are the comments from the trafficker, and the bubbles in yellow are the responses from the child. The child in this scenario is 15 years old. And you can see that the trafficker, the gang member, is requiring the child to recruit other victims, saying that he will pay her. The child is responding with, "How? I don't even know how to go about this. What do you want me to say?" And he's highlighting the fact that the gang is very violent and that is a way to gain control of these kids, and specifically making her admit that if she doesn't do it, what's going to happen to her. And she responds that she's aware that they will kill her. So we also see a lot of pictures online that are just promoting the trafficking of minors and trying to make it seem like they're making so much money, they can, get these new cars, they're so happy with the situation, they get all this jewelry, they get to go on fancy trips and things like that. But I know all of you in the room today are very well aware of the fact that that's not the reality of what we're seeing related to trafficking. We're seeing it as a very violent crime where not only are there sexual assaults, but there's actual violence with guns and threat of guns. We have had cases where, unfortunately, the missing child was recovered deceased as a result of either the buyer's violence or the trafficker's violence. We're seeing the long lasting impacts with anxiety and nightmares and flashbacks and loss of trust in others, suicidal ideation, and STIs and HIV, other sexually transmitted infections. And unfortunately, the quote that's in the top right in the red box is from one of the survivors that we have the privilege of working with, talking about the impacts, not only when she was going through this abuse, but forever on her body. Now, one thing I do want to highlight as a trend that we are seeing more and more frequently now than we ever did before is polyvictimization. So rarely of the reports that we're receiving they aren't typically just one thing anymore. Where in the past, it was child sex trafficking that also obviously included child sexual molestation. But starting in late 2019, all through the pandemic, is what we have seen is traffickers recognizing that they can make additional money from that child's victimization. And that is through the creation of child sexual abuse material, monetizing it, and selling it online. So they have realized that they can sell the child to as many buyers in the local geographic area, but that they can sell that imagery of the child to buyers all over the world 24/7, 365. So we're seeing online enticement to meet the child, those recruitment examples that I provided. Child sex trafficking victimization that includes child sexual molestation, and then the production of child sexual abuse material, the distribution and sale of that imagery. And that is particularly problematic because it requires different types of investigations. It requires different types of referrals for service and resources after the fact. And this is something, like I said, that we weren't seeing as commonly in the past, and it's been the most recent couple years. As a result of that and other forms of child sexual exploitation, we did recently launch a Take It Down initiative. It is the complement to what you might be aware of in the UK, Stop NCII, which is non consensual intimate imagery or revenge porn. So that's targeted towards adults. We have the child companion to that. It's called Take It Down. And if a child sex trafficking victim or a molestation victim or any victim is aware that their child sexual abuse material is online and being shared, they can go to takeitdown.necmec.org and complete a form. They can actually hash the images and provide those hash values to the National Center. And we will incorporate it into our work, which includes sharing hash lists with industry so that these companies will take down the imagery. We are trusted flaggers with a majority of the internet companies. So we're actually able to remove these images so much more quickly than we ever were in the past. We're able to provide these children with resources where in the past, people often said, once the images are out there, you can't get them back. And that is just no longer the case. So we're providing that agency, giving them that a little bit of that control back. Now, the last thing before I end this presentation, I do just want to highlight that I was only able to touch on a lot of these topics, just a little bit. We do have training that's free and is available online. It is in English, and we're working on additional languages, but unfortunately, we do not have any in Swedish just yet. But all of these resources and more are available at connect.missingkids.org. And again, you have to sign up and create an account, but it's free. And all of these specific trainings are free as well. There are sector specific. So there are some for mental health professionals, there are some for law enforcement, there are some for child welfare, social workers. And then there's a lot for the general public, just everyone can have access to. So I would definitely encourage you, if you would like more information on any of these topics, please feel free to utilize those resources. So with that, I was going to hopefully take questions and be able to interact with you after the presentation. I don't think that's going to be possible today. Here is my contact information. My email address is on the left side of the screen. And again, I can't thank you enough for giving me the opportunity, even remotely and even with a rough sounding voice, to be able to interact with you today. I'm so grateful that you've all made time to come together for this conference, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to see you at some point in the future.